Welcome here, everyone. My name is Jenny Johnson-Pils, and I'm the Secretary General of the Swedish Foundation for Human Rights. I think we recognize it, or have seen a few of you here before, because as many of you know, transitional justice is one of the focus areas for the Swedish Foundation and has been so for several years. So I think that you all share our enthusiasm today when we have Pablo de Greiff with us for this seminar. And I will not take up very much of the time because I know that we're all here to listen to Pablo. But I just wanted to say that we're very happy to have you here, and that we are co-organizing this together with THS and the Master Program for Human Rights. And I'm not sure if you know, but I think you may have to correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, that is the only university in Stockholm that have a course specifically on transitional justice. So therefore we're very happy to host this seminar together with you. And we've also got the help from Kjell-Åke Nordquist, who will facilitate this discussion, and we hope to have a lot of time for questions. So I hope that you are well prepared and have a lot of curious questions for Pablo to answer. I'm sure we'll have a great discussion. And with that, I would hand over to you, Kjell-Åke.
Thank you.
To start the seminar.
Thank you. Yes, it is a cooperation between the Swedish Foundation on Human Rights and Stockholm School. Welcome.
Sorry.
Stockholm School of Theology. And that's how it should be, because we are all in the same family, putting certain aspects and directions into topics that we all feel are very important to deal with in one way or another. And there are some words in this shared commitment that are particularly, shall I say, dirty, that we don't like. And one is impunity. And the other one is injustice, in particular systematic injustices. And there are two situations when these words come up to mind among many people concerned. And that is when dictatorships are about to fall and turn into democratic situations. And that is in post-conflict situations when peace seems to take the front seat, seem to take the lead. These two situations easily create vacuums which allow for impunity and injustices to be forgotten. And that's exactly when the concept of transitional justice comes in. And for us to reflect on this, there is no one better equipped to do that than Pablo de Greiff, UN Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, if I may say so. Most welcome to Stockholm and our seminar.
Let me start by thanking both the foundation and the theology faculty for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I love coming to Stockholm, despite the fact that I have only been here in winter time. I fear that if I am ever invited in summertime, I will move. So perhaps that's why I'm not invited in summer. In any case, thank you very much for taking the trouble to come. I am very, very happy to be here. I would like to keep my intervention short so that we can have some discussion. And I will make a series of remarks about the way that I perceive the state of transitional justice, despite the fact that, as you may know, the resolution that creates the mandate that I now hold does not use the term transitional justice. And it doesn't for a variety of reasons that we can discuss if anyone is interested. I have a ridiculously sounding official title, which prevents me from using business cards. I whole scroll. I am officially known as the Special Rapporteur for the promotion of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Or as my wife says, I'm the Special Rapporteur for peace, justice, beauty, and love. But in any case, I will use transitional justice as shorthand for the mouthful truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, and say a few things about the way that I see both the accomplishments and some of the challenges that the field faces, and what I am trying to do from the standpoint of the mandate to contribute to the meeting of the challenges. So let me start in a sort of celebratory way by pointing out some of the accomplishments of the field. And I think that there are two fundamental ones to begin with. First, the field managed to consolidate itself. It is now a field, and it has all the trappings of a field. Both a field of theory, of academic activity. It has all of it. Classes in academic centers, masters and PhD students, and I assume that some of you are in those categories. PhD dissertations are written, books are published. There is a specialized journal on transitional justice. And for those of you who care for the sociology of knowledge, the ultimate marker of a field coming into its own now, an encyclopedia. So Cambridge just published the first encyclopedia of transitional justice. And really, again, in a sort of celebratory mode, briefly, this has happened in a remarkably short period of time. So again, because I have this odd interest in the sociology of knowledge, it took significantly shorter for transitional justice to get its encyclopedia than it has taken, I'm sorry to say, peace studies, conflict resolution, Holocaust studies. So all those fields that have by now, of course, encyclopedias of their own, otherwise they would not be respectable academic fields. All of them got their encyclopedia much later than the establishment of the first academic center devoted to the study of those respective fields, and significantly later than the first class on each of those subjects was ever taught in a university. So transitional justice really managed to consolidate itself as a field of academic activity in a surprisingly short period of time. Of course, the academic side of transitional justice is, I hope, even those of us who are interested in the field from an academic perspective would concede is the least important part of it. Transitional justice managed to consolidate itself as a field of practice in a similarly short period of time. And there again, it has all the trappings of an established field of practice. There are trainings on the topic, different government institutions that are responsible both for training, capacity building, and for supporting transitional justice activities. There are ministries. Now the Tunisian government has established a ministry for human rights and transitional justice. And this is the first ministry that incorporates the expression in its title and, of course, in its functions. But there are sections of ministries in different parts of the world. Switzerland has a dedicated division for dealing with the past, which is obviously the name that transitional justice has acquired within the ministry. The Swedish government actively supports transitional justice initiatives in different parts of the world. The Dutch government is a very strong supporter of transitional justice. In any case, now it is a very well-established field of practice, of international attention, and of support. Even the World Bank, that an institution that is not very well known for its interest in justice-related work, has become increasingly receptive about transitional justice work, and in the 2011 WDR, it includes a lot of talk about transitional justice. So there's absolutely no question that the field has come on its own. And notice that I'm talking about the field rather than referring to particular programs, which in turn, one must add, are the really important part of the work. But, I will leave that aside for a second. The point is that now we are talking about something that has an independent identity, and that different people in different parts of the world think it is sufficiently important both to study and to actively support, and support in many ways, politically, economically, and in terms of operations. Now, the fact that the field managed to consolidate itself in this way is an accomplishment. And it's an accomplishment that could not have been taken for granted even 15 or 20 years ago. Those of you who have a sufficiently long memory of the way that the field developed would remember the very, very heated disputes that at the time were called the truth versus justice debates. So a field that now thinks of itself as consolidating 4 different strands of work that happen to be part of the title of the mandate that I now hold, as if they were parts of a comprehensive whole, just 15 or 20 years ago, were not at all conceived in complementary terms, but rather in terms of mutual exclusion. You either had to choose truth or justice, but not the same. And the idea that this would be parts of a comprehensive or a holistic policy, as now we talk about the field, was completely foreign, and I don't think that it could have been predicted. The final sort of celebratory point that I will make about the state of the field is not only that it managed to consolidate itself and to become everything that we have just mentioned, it also managed to normalize itself, in the sense that transitional justice is now part of the normal expected reaction to a certain type or types of political transitions. First, it became eventually the perfectly normal response to transitions from authoritarianism. Now it is part of the perfectly normal response to those transitions, but also to transitions out of conflict. And now there are an increasingly larger number of internationally binding documents that codify the rights to each of the elements that we have been talking about, perhaps exaggerating a bit with respect to guarantees of non-repetition that seem to be a slightly different category, and we can discuss about that. But with respect to truth, reparations, and justice, understood in terms of criminal justice, there is absolutely no question that there is an increasingly stable, recognized, binding international regime that regulates the expectations that people can have about those 3 domains. And that the scope of application of that legal architecture keeps growing and growing, as I just mentioned, from becoming a normal response to transitions from authoritarianism to now, even more so, becoming a normal response to transitions out of conflict. And again, the fact that this happened in a fairly short period of time, we are talking really less than 30 years, I think is a significant accomplishment. And in those two senses, I think that there's a lot to be said about the state of the field. Enough celebration, because of course, alongside all of this, there are incredible challenges that the field still faces. I notice the formulation, there are some challenges that have been with the field from the beginning, in addition to new ones that have emerged, at least in part, related to its own success. So I will talk about very briefly about two external challenges. External in the sense that they are not, these are challenges that are not generated by the field itself, and two more internal challenges, challenges that arise out of the field's own understanding of itself and what it can offer through its implementation. I think that to talk about the external challenges first, everyone who works in the justice and rights related arenas has some reason to worry about the emergence or the re-emergence of what can be called a new type of developmentalism. So exaggerating a bit, if one can say that the last 2 or 3 decades were decades in which the international space was occupied largely and prominently by lawyers, I think that we have reasons to worry whether the decades that we are starting to live through are not decades in which the international arena will be occupied by economists rather than by lawyers. So if you think about the winds blowing in international cooperation, there are some manifestations of this sort of developmentalism. Again, the reasons why that is the case, it would be an interesting discussion to have, and I would love to hear your views about this. But I think that there is a bit of concern that development is going to dominate the international agenda in a way that it did not do it in the last 2 or 3 decades. And that is an understanding of development that is a bit emptied or separate from concerns about justice and rights. And of course, I am talking at a very broad level of generality. There's a lot of nuance that could be introduced in all these points. And I am talking about trends for which, of course, there are also counter trends. The WDR, the 2011 WDR, for example, which, as I mentioned, introduces a lot of justice talk into the development discourse, could be taken as a manifestation of a counter-trend. The seemingly positive direction that the post-2015 development goals discussions is taken can also be taken as a counter-trend. So, I mean, I'm talking at a broad level of generality, and we can discuss whether this is worth exploring. In relation to that, however, and this is the second external challenge that I think the field faces, and it faces this challenge alongside all other justice and rights related areas. I think that it is under great pressure to talk much more intelligently about its own impact. So there is a significant change in both discourse and practice at the international level concerning the demonstration of impact of different interventions, particularly those that are donor dependent. So if you think the very, very significant change in policy on the part of the UK and DFID in favor of what they call a results orientation, that is only one example out of many that could be cited in order to illustrate this case. Even philanthropic assistance on the part of the typical large-scale US-based foundations, almost without exception. They have adopted the same rhetoric of a results orientation. And again, I don't think that there's a coincidence. I think that these are also part of interrelated trends, and we ought to be aware of those. Because I don't think that transitional justice is in a particularly poor position to talk about its impact compared to human rights related work or, for example, rule of law interventions. I think that all of them in general do a lousy work in describing their own impact. And this is something that the field, again, is going to have to confront, because I don't think it can exempt itself from very, very broad trends that will affect the way that, among other things, international cooperation works. But again, these are just two things that I mentioned that we can talk about. I want to concentrate, of course, on challenges that the field faces internally. And again, what I mean is challenges that arise from the way that the field understands itself. The first one has to do with an issue, and this is one of those challenges that has been with the field from the beginning. It relates to the field's own internal coherence. Remember that I celebrated the fact that the field managed to consolidate itself, to think and describe a position according to which justice, reparations, truth-telling, and institutional reform were parts of a coherent whole, and that in order to do that it was necessary to stem the centrifugal forces that are characteristic of a field that advocates for the implementation, simultaneous and interrelated implementation of not just one set of policies, but a plurality, in this case four that were initially thought to compete against one another. So the field has done a very good job at stemming those centrifugal forces, but that doesn't mean that it has solved the fact that there are indeed some centrifugal forces that risk pulling the field apart. This is manifested in practice by the fact that to this day the absolutely uniform reaction of governments that find themselves under pressure to implement transitional justice measures, their initial move is to think of those measures, as measures amongst which choices and trade-offs ought to be made. And the typical trade-off is we're going to establish a truth commission. So we will make concessions in favor of truth, some concessions in favor of reparations, so that we have the excuse not to do anything in terms of justice. And I think that this is still the case. So we talk about transitional justice as being a holistic notion. It is holistic only in theory. In practice, it is far from being holistic. There is no country to this day that has truly designed and implemented a holistic transitional justice policy. What we find is that different countries implement different transitional justice initiatives piecemeal, with very little coordination with one another, with very little foresight of what the appropriate links between the measures ought to look like. And in retrospect, it is easier, of course, to call that a comprehensive policy, when in fact it was never designed in that way. So this is a manifestation of the fact that in practice, this is a challenge that remains. I will exaggerate a bit, but only a bit, in describing a scenario in which the field may come apart. So think about the fact that criminal justice will likely be a solid part of the agenda of at least certain types of transitions. I'm not saying that it will be implemented, I'm saying that it will always be discussed as a component of a transition. The international community seems to like truth commissions rhetorically, but in fact truth commissions are very, very weakly supported. Reparations programs have never been supported by the international community by way of finances, and institutional reform measures continue to this day to be solidly in the domain of security experts, largely indifferent to justice and rights-related considerations. So you project this trajectory 15 or 20 years down the line, and where we will find ourselves is where we were in the 80s. In other words, a sprinkling of criminal justice initiatives, rhetorical support for truth-telling measures, almost no support whatsoever for reparations, and the SSR and the institutional reform programs that are largely conceived as security rather than as justice-related measures. And that is the undoing of the field. So again, this is some exaggeration, but not by much. The general point I want to make, of course, is that there is still an issue about what it means for the four measures to be fully integrated into a comprehensive whole and to make part of a holistic policy rather than a piecemeal approach. The second issue, the second challenge that I think relates to the way that the field understands itself has to do in some ways with the issue of impact. But here I'm not talking about external requests for the assessment of impact, but rather to perhaps something that should be more surprising. That the very point of engaging in transitional justice work is still up for grabs. So despite the huge success that the field has had in consolidating and normalizing itself, there is absolutely no agreement of what it is about. Why the hell do we do this? Yeah? So the range of alternatives is huge. Think about the list of aims that are attributed to the implementation of transitional justice measures. Transitional justice measures are said to accomplish an incredible catalog of things. They heal, they reconcile, they strengthen the rule of law, they increase social harmony, they do all sorts of things. How do they accomplish such wonderful ends? I think that this is a fundamental challenge that we still face. We need a better account of the reasons why we engage in these efforts to begin with, if we aspire to have an account of whether what we do is effective or not. So unless there is a systematic effort to think through the relationship between the design of the measures and the ends that it is reasonable to expect them to achieve, there is absolutely no way of engaging in serious evaluation of whether they are effective or not. And therefore, I think that it is absolutely crucial for the field to get serious about its own ends. Now, I am focusing, of course, in this problem regarding transitional justice. I do not want to give the impression that, again, transitional justice is in a worse position than any other area that relates to rights or to justice. I think that this is a difficulty that the transitional justice shares with the justice and rights related areas of work. And again, we can in the question and answer period discuss why this is the case. I think that it has something to do with a certain confusion between justification and explanation. The fact that of course, in order to justify justice and rights-related work, you can simply point out to their relationship with something that is supposed to have intrinsic value, namely justice, and that seems to put an end to that discussion. But there is the huge domain of explanation. How can we explain the effectiveness of certain measures and not others? I will just take a few minutes to conclude on ways of confronting some of these challenges and the sort of role that the mandate can play in coming to grips with some of them. A good part of the work that I have done in the past has to do precisely with the efforts to articulate the links between the different elements of a comprehensive transitional justice policy. And here I will only give the briefest description of a way of understanding the linkages, and therefore understanding how that account can be used for purposes of analysis and evaluation. Despite all the differences that obtain between the four different elements in the policy, justice, truth, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, I think that there are certain claims that can be safely made. And notice the rhetorical sleight of hand. Whenever I say something can be safely claimed, your alarms should go off in a major way. So let's discuss this, because I don't want to talk all the time. But this is what I claim can be safely said. Despite the differences, I think arguably transitional justice measures promote the following four goals. All of them, truth-telling, reparations, justice, and guarantees of non-recurrence, are meant to provide recognition to victims. This is their first and fundamental goal. And it's not just recognition of the suffering that the victims endured, it is also recognition primarily of their status as the bearers of rights. So what transitional justice tries to do is to send signals about the fact that victims are rights holders. And this is something that all the measures are intended to do. The second thing that all the measures can be said to try to do is to promote a certain type of basic, elementary trustworthiness on the part of institutions. So transitional justice measures, again, the whole catalog, try to send the message that the institutions under which citizens live deserve their trust. Perhaps for the first time, perhaps anew, but that someone is taking seriously the fact that human rights violations took place in the past. The third goal that I think can be attributed to transitional justice is all of them are meant to strengthen the rule of law. And again, you will begin to see an emerging argumentative pattern. These goals that I am attributing to transitional justice are not random, but rather systematically related to one another. And most importantly, I want to argue, systematically related to the design of the measures themselves. So here, what I want to say is that there is an account of transitional justice that doesn't merely work at the level of aspirations, attributing to the goals all sorts of miraculous effects, but that rather you can construct an account of transitional justice work in which the measures are systematically related to the goals that are attributed to them. And the fourth goal that I want to say transitional justice work seeks to accomplish is, again, a certain type, very, very thin and perhaps brittle, but nevertheless significant type of social reconciliation, which can be understood in terms of a basic form of social integration. Now, obviously, one can talk for hours about this. So let me illustrate a bit how the ends are systematically related with the design of the measures. There are two basic social mechanisms that explain how the measures accomplish the goals that I am talking about. Transitional justice measures work to the extent that they do because they are effective mechanisms of norm affirmation. They are an effective way for society to send signals about the significance of certain norms, first. And secondly, the measures work to the extent that they do because they have a certain capacity to articulate and to disarticulate social groups. So in every country where discussions about the implementation of transitional justice measures have taken place, one of the effects that becomes most apparent is that a large number of civil society organizations are formed in order to take part in the discussions about how the measures are to be implemented or not. And this is true regardless of all other contextual factors. The fact is that NGOs form at a very, very fast rate when transitional justice is in the public agenda of a country. And I think that this is very, very important. Now, that capacity for affirming the importance of norms and for helping to constitute or reconstitute civil society explain why and how it is that the implementation of the measures can lead to the four goals that I mentioned before. It explains why they are effective in providing recognition to victims, precisely through the norm affirmation and through the possibility of offering a protective social space within which victims can reassert their rights and exercise their rights in the public sphere. It explains why the measures are effective in gathering a certain degree of social trust in the institutions of the state. The meaning of saying that the measures can make a contribution to strengthening the rule of law, and the minimal sense of social reconciliation that I'm talking about, that has very little to do with people starting to love one another, and has much more to do with the fact that they start living in such a way that they feel sufficiently protected by the institutions of the state to exercise and occupy a space in the public sphere. So again, here what interests me is the following. There are ways of understanding this field that can make sense of the practice and that help to resolve the issue of how to think about why it is important, whether it is achieving its goals or not, and how to assess its operations. Of course, there is no theoretical magic bullet for a problem that is also practical, and therefore a lot of the work on the mandate is not purely theoretical, but also very, very practical. I have announced 3 strategic areas of interest for the next 3 years, which are related to some of the things that I have mentioned. I think that it is important for the mandate to contribute to clarifying the links between the 4 different measures. First area of strategic interest. Secondly, I think it is important for the mandate to clarify the links between those 4 measures and broader areas of policy intervention, including security and development. And third, I think it is important for the mandate to contribute to improving the efficacy of the measures in post-conflict settings. The implementation of transitional justice in post-conflict countries is a very settled trend. From my standpoint, it is not clear that the success of the measures in those contexts can be taken for granted. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make them more effective in very challenging post-conflict settings. And I would like to contribute to these 3 areas. We can talk, I was told to talk for 40 minutes and I have 3 minutes left. I want to stay within the time. I will mention we can talk about both the selection of particular topics to work on, but also about the country strategy that I intend to follow, and I will just say a couple of things about this. One should not overestimate the capacities of special procedures. There is no big institution on whose shoulders I stand. Special procedures are notoriously weak infrastructurally, and given the financial crisis that is affecting the UN as well, this doesn't leave special procedures unaffected. There is a variety of ways in which I engage in communication, both with governments and with civil society organizations. But one of the primary ways is through making official country visits. There again, there are some significant constraints. The budget of the special procedures allows for 2 country visits per year. That's it. That's all there is in terms of an official country visit. I took the first one in November to Tunisia, and I will be happy to talk about the results of that visit. And I will go to Guatemala at the end of June. I made a request to the government of Nepal in the first year, for the first year of the mandate. That visit is not going to happen anytime in the near future. Obviously, I need the agreement of the government for me to make a country visit, and the government of Nepal is not going to agree to my visit anytime in the near future. I made a request to the government of Guinea, and there's an in-principle agreement accepting the visit. And I made a request to the government of Spain. Spain has very, very large unresolved issues relating to this area. And I want to point out in every way, including the selection of country requests, that these are problems that do not affect only poor developing countries, but that cut across all sorts of distinctions. After much delay, the government of Spain has accepted my request for a visit, so I will be going in January of next year. And we can talk about future possibilities and visits, and I would love to get your impressions about what's urgent and what is not. I am trying to convince OHCHR about the adoption of models of regional as opposed to single country visits. It seems to me that regarding this particular constellation of problems, there are at least two very important areas where the regional dimensions of the conflict become particularly obvious. And that is the Great Lakes and the Balkans. I think that making isolated country visits to either of those two regions is much less productive than trying to adopt a regional perspective. And I'm in the process of trying to get that through. And since I have run out of time, I think that I will stop here and let's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much so far. We will say thank you once more because we will actually would like to decide what you should talk about.
Yeah.
We thought that you should relax now, but now it's our turn to focus on issues that we have been thinking of and that has come up maybe right now during your presentation. While you are formulating your questions, can I use the chairman's privilege and ask the first one? Because that would be, you describe the relationship between victims, norms and institutions. And you say that it's a tricky relationship between them and it's difficult for countries, for nations to come up and design something that keeps all these four major components that you have in your mandate to keep them together. And then I ask myself, what situations are we talking about post-conflict? How much can we expect of capacity to live up to a decent standard of transitional justice in those particular situations where transitional justice is most needed? Isn't there a contradiction in the field? Just to start with.
This is but now I expect the very difficult question from you, Kjell-Åke. So thanks a lot. Look, I think that we are, in many ways, the social sciences are very primitive. We have a much better understanding of end states than of processes of transformation. So our understanding of the dynamics of reform, and this is true of the three spheres that sociologists are fond of speaking about: transforming institutions, transforming cultures, and transforming individuals. We have a lousy understanding of how those processes work. And I think that the truth is we are much better, for example, from the standpoint of normative theory, at articulating views about what would be ideal, and on the standpoint of the hard, descriptive social sciences, at describing particular time-sliced states, than we are at understanding how to get from here to there. So, again, the reasons why this is so we can discuss. I am convinced that the fact that working human rights and in the justice-related arena is so compelling from a justificatory standpoint, that very, very compelling nature of the work has given us the impression, all of us working with these things, that we do not need to worry about the hard work of describing minutiae such as processes of institutional transformation. As long as we have a very good description of the end state that we want to achieve, that's all we need to worry about. But that, of course, is a huge and fundamental mistake. So the short answer to your question is, yes, I think that there is a huge deficit in the field. Because as all other justice-related areas of work, it is very good at describing how things ought to look like, without a very fine-grained analysis of factors such as institutional capacities, to achieve those end states. And therefore, the big dissonance between the way that things look in books and documents and texts, and the very messy reality of trying to achieve any of those things in the field. I think that one of the critical needs that the field faces is precisely a better understanding of what it means to implement the measures in contexts that are very different from the ones that gave a birth to the field. And let me illustrate the point very concretely. If you think historically, the field really emerged out of the post-authoritarian transitions of the Latin American Southern continent. This is where it became identified as something distinctive. But it traveled in the short period of time that I was mentioning at the beginning, from the post-authoritarian to the post-conflict settings. But think about the huge difference between a setting like Buenos Aires or Santiago on the one hand, and Kinshasa or Bujumbura on the other. These are very, very different worlds, and they are very different in some dimensions that are critical to the implementation of the measures. They are very different in terms of institutional strength in the first place. So Chilean and Argentinian institutions, for all their imperfections, could make the following two claims. First, to cover the entire national territory. Unevenly, of course, as in virtually every country, but not because of lack of capacity, but because of whatever political decisions led to the disparities. And secondly, Argentinian and Chilean institutions could claim that they were part of a framework, a legal framework, in which there were no significant gaps. In other words, most of the major spheres in the relationship between citizens and the institutions of the state were already the subject of legal regulation. Imperfectly implemented with all sorts of problems, that is irrelevant to the point. The point is that there was existing legal regulation for most of the major spheres of interaction between citizens and institutions. When you move to most of the post-conflict settings where the implementation of the measures is being attempted, neither of those two characteristics obtain. Furthermore, the type of violations that the measures were intended to redress in the post-authoritarian settings were not only of a kind, and fairly narrow kind, so most reparations programs, for example, in the post-authoritarian settings, covered a very narrow catalogue of all the violations that took place prior to the transition. But all the conditions were given because of the narrow range of violations that took place, namely the violations typical of overbearing authoritarian states. Those are very different from the much wider catalogue of violations that take place during a time of generalized conflict. In the post-conflict settings, the conditions that make it difficult for the measures to be successfully implemented, not only those conditions that have to do with factors of institutional strength, but others, such as availability of resources, capacities, the ease in making plausible attributions of responsibility, a fairly limited universe of victims that need to be redressed, a very low number, relatively speaking, of agents of violence. None of those obtain in the post-conflict settings. We are really in a different world. And yet, there is nothing in the practice, let alone relevant legal documents, that would suggest that these differences are real that they have consequences, and that they need to be confronted seriously in the design and the implementation of the problems. And therefore, yes, I think that we are facing a very, very severe difficulty here.
I didn't intend to ask such a question with such a long answer. Please, the floor is open.
You said before that Spain still has unsolved issues, and in one way it will always be unsolved issues from the past. How do you know when to stop a transitional justice process? When are you finished in one way and can go to the next step?
That's an excellent question. Strictly speaking, I think that one is never completely finished. But of course, I am not naive. Political space as topological space, real space, can be occupied by only so many agents at the same time. In the case of political space, by only so many issues at the same time. I think that there are, however, very obvious negative markers of when the task remains far from being done. First, when there is, of course, the deliberate adoption of blockages to airing of the past. So when there is a deliberate decision that there are certain things that will not be examined, that will not be spoken about, certain categories of victims that will not be recognized, then you have a very clear indication that you have a far way to go before the job is done. And in most of the countries that are likely to become the subject of my attention as a special rapporteur, that is precisely the domain in which we are moving. We are talking, in most of these cases, not about a recognition that is not perfect. I have no such aspirations. We are rather talking about lack of recognition, usually of a very deliberate kind. So deliberate in some cases that it is written into law. Right? So amnesties, for example, for certain types of crime constitute precisely that type of blockage. The prohibition to talk about certain things. There are countries in the world in which talking about conflict is outlawed. There are countries in the world in which huge categories of victims of the most serious human rights abuses have remained completely unrecognized by any means. So I'm not talking about guaranteeing that people end up in heaven. I am trying to do something to contribute that people do not remain in hell. And I think that there's a difference between those two.
There is a little difference between heaven and hell. Somebody else that would like to reflect on that? Yes, both of you gentlemen, you and your colleague. You can choose.
Yes, my name is Ulf B. Andersson. I'm a journalist at Amnesty Press, Amnesty International's magazine. If I can put two concrete examples. First of all, you mentioned the Great Lakes area. And yesterday, one man showed up at the US Embassy in Kigali, Bosco Ntaganda. And I think that he will be transferred to the National Criminal Court in Hague. Do you see this as some kind of breakthrough for some positive developments in an area of the world where most horrific violations has been going on for several years? And the other concrete question about ICC is, in February 2011, there was a big hope when United Nations Security Council made the referral of the situation in Libya to ICC. And today, no one is talking about ICC or any kind of justice in Libya. There are two persons that are. I mean, ICC wants to indict Senussi, the former security chief, and Saif al-Islam, and they are in prison in Libya and nothing is happening. Why is the world not interested today in the situation in Libya?
Can I ask if somebody else is sitting with question related to ICC as well? You are?
Well, my
Please.
question is really related to that last question because it's about the situation in Syria. Whether, especially from the European perspective, transitional justice has been considered as something to think about in Syria, and on the other hand, whether your department is considering Syria as one of the possible countries to intervene in this sense.
Thank you. Any more ICC related issue? Please.
Thank you very much for the two questions. And in a certain sense, I am surprised that these are the only ICC-related questions, because it usually capitalizes a good part of the discussions.
We haven't finished yet.
Yeah. So here are a few thoughts. My mandate is one that includes justice as one of its components. And I think that this is a very important dimension of the mandate. In fact, if one is talking about the capacity to affirm the importance of certain basic norms, human beings have had a hard time looking for a functional alternative to the imposition of criminal penalties for the violation of certain norms. In other words, this is the most serious way of delivering a message of the currency and the validity and the bindingness of certain norms. It's very difficult to find an alternative to criminal justice. And to that extent, of course, I think that efforts to achieve justice, both at the national and the international level, are a significant contribution to transitional processes. Having said that, however, two additional points. I think, and there is now emerging consensus about this. You may want to dispute this as another rhetorical sleight of hand that will provoke suspicion. But nevertheless, I think that there is increasing recognition about the fact that the hopes that we once placed in international jurisdictions were perhaps overblown, and that if there is a choice to be made, there are many reasons why national jurisdictions are preferable over international jurisdictions. And some of them have to do precisely with the questions of ownership, of the distance from the potential beneficiaries of the justice efforts that are illustrated in this case, not to speak about underlying suspicions and questions about possible double standards in the application of justice on the part of the international community. And these are questions that remain as serious issues that we need to confront. So that, I have said, criminal justice is an important part of the transitional justice policy. Secondly, there are reasons to think that justice at the national level has some advantages over justice at the international level. But third, and this is my final point about this, notice that this is a mandate that includes justice as only one of its elements. I have been working on transitional justice for 20 years now, and part of the reason why I remain interested in the field, despite all the problems that I still see in it, is precisely because of its non-reductive character. The fact that it is a field that concedes that there are different dimensions of justice, and that processes of social transformation cannot be reduced to any one of those dimensions. And in fact, part of my agenda is precisely to insist that transitional justice, no matter how holistically conceived, doesn't exhaust the agenda of political transformation, that there are other measures with which transitional justice ought to be accompanied. This is part of what I take to be significant about the field and the perspective from which I judge the effectiveness, the relative effectiveness and the relative importance of particular institutional efforts such as the ICC and events around it. So there is much to celebrate in the establishment of the court. I think at the same time it would be naive to think that transitional justice can be made to depend on the operation of a single institution, no matter how important it is.
Yesterday, the trial against Efraim Rios Montt in Guatemala started. He's accused of severe massacres 32 years ago. Would you say that the transition justice, the process in Guatemala, contributed to this trial 10 or 15 years after the both truth commissions? Is there evidence-based attribution to the trial from the transitional justice process?
I don't think that I have seen anything that conclusively establishes through, for example, tracing processes and establishes their causal link between the two commissions, the RENI and the Historical Clarification Commission reports, and the initiation of the trials. On the other hand, given the role that the two exercises played in Guatemalan history, the two processes of the two commissions, it is very hard to abstract from those exercises and say it is as if they had no importance. Among other things, because of concrete instantiation of the phenomenon that I was mentioning before about the capacity of transitional justice measures to articulate social groups. In the process of the operation of both the RENI and the Historical Clarification Commission operations, huge processes of social organization were unleashed, including processes that had an impact on the way that, for example, indigenous communities understood their place in Guatemalan society. And it is very difficult to think now that those processes of redefining identities along the tenor of rights and the ability to claim rights are indifferent to the trials that took so many years and so much effort to finally get started. So I think that there is something incredibly significant about the work that was done at the time. Having said this, however, I hasten to add that I use Guatemala as an example of a country which shows the disadvantages of thinking about the different transitional justice measures as if they were isolated from one another. So standalone transitional justice measures are less effective and more problematic than transitional justice measures that bear some relationship to one another. The Guatemalan experiment with the Comisión Nacional de Resarcimiento, the Reparations Commission that was established as a purely standalone reparations commission, I think is much more problematic than the experience with reparations of other countries that have integrated the reparations work with the work of a truth commission. So,
such as in South Africa.
Except that it's a tricky thing because there are two or three aspects of the South African experiment that are tricky. First, the explicit and constitutionally affirmed trade-off between truth and justice. Secondly, what most people would consider to be the severely flawed experiment with reparations. So, assessing the linkages of assessing the effectiveness of a link between reparations and truth based on the South African model, I think it's complicated. I think that there are more positive examples of how the linkages can be articulated, including to some extent Peru, certainly Chile, and without a doubt Morocco, in which the reparations and the truth-telling were very, very closely linked with one another.
Still have time? Yes, please.
Thinking about South Africa and this sort of, when you go through a reconciliation process and then you declare, oh, now we are done. And I'm thinking that when you're at a point when you make such a declaration, afterwards it might become like a significant political hurdle to sort of like say, oh wait, we weren't done, let's start again. And where do you see your mandate in like coming to countries such as South Africa and saying, oh well, maybe you weren't done, maybe you need to continue, and what sort of like obstacles you face in situations like that?
I think, the short and easy answer is that there are huge constraints that limit the choices that I make with respect to country work. There is, put yourself in my shoes. You have 3 years and 6 country visits. And very different considerations about which are relevant to the decision about where to go, including, for example, some purely external ones. The visits have to be geographically distributed. I cannot go to Africa alone. Right? There are all sorts of reasons why that is the case, but there has to be plausible and defensible geographical distribution of work. You have to worry about the fact that the Human Rights Council needs to renew the mandate in 3 years' time. Not renew me, renew the mandate. The mandate may be allowed to lapse. And of course, I think that would be a bad outcome. I would like the mandate to be renewed. I think it can make a useful contribution. But this all means that there's a huge opportunity cost to every decision that you make. So every country that you decide to put in the list means that you're excluding about 20 that could be in the list. Now, having said that, would you go to a country like South Africa instead of going to a country like Burundi or Nepal or Guatemala? You see, so here we're not talking about the ideal world. Here we're talking about the very hard reality of the fact that I have 6 country visits in 3 years. And then I need to prioritize those in a way that makes sense. So I have laid out some of the criteria that I am trying to use in making the decisions. I would like, to the extent possible, to establish a relationship between the country visits and the three thematic areas that I described before. I would like the country visits to respond both to a sense of immediate urgency, but also to make a long-lasting contribution to the understanding of the field and how it works. Ideally, one would like to pay visits to countries that have some sort of spillover regional effect, so that given that you only visit 6, if you can choose some that have spillover effects, you are affecting more than only those 6. So on plausible, just very rapid estimations of the relevant constraints, it is very unlikely that some countries will emerge at the top of that list. It is very likely that others will. There is, for example, a distinction between countries that are in a position similar to South Africa in the sense of the countries that have already gone through the implementation of the measures, where there are surely pending challenges that need to be met, and that are a sort of retrospective examination of the operation of the measures. I would put in the same category, for example, Sierra Leone and Liberia to some extent. So these are East Timor would be included in this group, by the way. So 4 countries that are on my list as possible candidates for visits of a retrospective nature, and with an important dimension of a message to the international community about the length of its commitment to at least 3 out of these 4 countries. So Liberia, Sierra Leone, and East Timor are countries that received massive amounts of international attention, except for a fairly short period of time. And then no one talks about them anymore. So it would be interesting to do this sort of retrospective visits. However, there are 2 categories of countries that I cannot forget. Primarily, of course, the countries where the issue is live now. It's not that we are examining how the measures were implemented in the past. It's that we are trying to make sure that the measures are implemented now, because it is urgent, because there are people that are suffering, because there are victims that have gone unrecognized and they are dying. The story that you can imagine. And another category of countries that, again, I do not want to forget, a sort of prospective cases in which you can say, okay, we are watching. I said my first remark was about the institutional weakness of special procedures. What they do have, certainly, is a great convening power and a great signaling power of the fact that the international community is paying attention to particular situations. And in that category, there are some countries where that type of signal can be useful if sent prospectively. Careful, the international community is watching you. I would love to hear your views about countries that you would visit and that you would suggest I visit. So, really, I welcome views about that.
Thank you. Time is passing, but I think we should give ourselves space for one more short question and an appropriate answer. That's okay, isn't it?
Yes.
So, what would you think still remains to be said here? Yes, please.
I don't know if it is would be nice to be said, but I'll try. My name is Malin Eriksson, and I work at the Swedish Development Corporation SIDA on democracy and human rights at the conflict department, and mainly with the DRC. So first of all, on your proposal to visit the two countries to look at the Great Lakes as a region, I think that's an excellent idea. So I support that. My question is a bit on that. A country like the DRC, where it's really weak political ownership for transitional justice and actually for any reform, justice reform or other reforms as well. What can we do? And how can we work with civil society? Because that is one way, in one way that we are working in the DRC. And what are your experience on that? What are sort of the most strategic entry points and etc.? And now this is the DRC, but perhaps you have experience from, I mean, you do have experience from several other countries as well that are in conflict and conflict, like the DRC is, because it's still conflict. So it would be very interesting to know.
Yeah, thank you very much, because it allows me to go back to something that I think is absolutely fundamental. Remember that I mentioned two social mechanisms in order to account for the effectiveness of transitional justice measures. One of them is normal affirmation, but the other one is the articulation and disarticulation of social groups. In other words, for me, there is absolutely no way to account for whatever effectiveness transitional justice work that does not include an account of the crucial role that civil society plays in the process of transition, and that should be the end goal of the process of transition. Now, this morning in a different meeting, I also made the point that it is much easier for us to think about targeting policy decisions that come out of the normal policy-making channels, either executive action or parliamentary initiative. In that respect, the work that we do is incredibly state-centric. It targets state institutions for the most part. But there is something horrendously inconvenient about that. That is really that it leaves out of consideration factors that, rather than having to do with institutional strength and effectiveness, have much more to do with social resilience, with the way that social groups reconstitute themselves, the way that they are able to penetrate entrenched constellations of power, and the way that they relate to one another, the way that they relate to the media, to economic spheres, to political parties. I think that these are crucial elements in an effective transitional justice process. But yet, when I ask both of others and of myself, so what's the agenda for having a positive impact on factors having to do with social resilience? I have to say that I find on the part of audiences, as well as myself, a much shorter list of things to do in the second sphere. And I think that that is regretful. And I extend very explicitly an invitation to think more about those issues and to share your thoughts with me, because I am absolutely convinced that without strengthening the capacities of civil society, there are very few transitions that would take place. Look, I have never seen a transitional process that is born out of the totally unmotivated initiative of a government to reform itself. It just doesn't happen that way. So the closest that comes to that in my professional experience is the very, very directed and controlled transitional process in Morocco. But even there, of course, it was not unmotivated. So a lot depended on the king's initiative, but not all of it. The king wasn't simply a modernizing transformer who one good day woke up and said, oh, let's establish a truth commission. People have been asking for it actively and complaining about it, and they had tried to establish a reparations board that didn't satisfy anyone, and they needed something else to do. So strengthening the civil society side of transitional processes, I think, is absolutely indispensable. And there, again, the agenda should be strengthened from my perspective. So Libya, for example, right now is experimenting with interesting things having to do with the licensing of NGOs. Right? So it was very difficult to establish an NGO in Libya before, as could have been predicted. So one of the first measures that the government is experimenting with is making it virtually hassle-free to establish, to give legal identity to a civil society organization. So simplifying licensing agreements, I think sounds remote, outlandish, and ineffective. But if it is true that civil society organizations play an important role in transitions, certainly unburdening them from huge obstacles is not a bad place to start. It goes without saying that the typical things that people pay lip service to but rarely take very seriously, like capacity building initiatives for civil society organizations, financial support, etc., etc. I think that these are things that we now find yet another set of reasons to take seriously and to contemplate what we are doing and whether we have taken the best possible tack on questions having to do with the strength of civil society. And I have to say, I have been very, very gratified in this visit, because a good part of the discussions have been about how to strengthen the role of civil society in these processes. And I want to give a huge vote of confidence on those initiatives and to encourage you to do even more of that.
I think Pablo de Greiff has shared a lot of his knowledge and experience with us generously this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming, for inviting us to share your challenges in the future. And most welcome back to Sweden whenever you're ticking off all your countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. When we extended the invitation and you agreed, we were of course extremely happy about that. And as I said, we've had many seminars and efforts throughout the years, and this is sort of the peak. So I was thinking, what should we do after this? But I'm glad to say that after the discussions we've had today, I think we have about 100 different ideas of how we can move on. So for those of you who are here and that are especially interested in transitional justice and areas connected to that, please keep an eye on our homepage, because this is also being filmed, so you can go back and watch it or share it with those who didn't have the opportunity to be here. But we will also advertise coming seminars and other activities. And I would just also like to say that coming from a human rights organization, we often tend to look at problems or things that needs to be solved, and one of the areas that I've received a lot of criticism is the Human Rights Council. But to take another role and be more positive, I would just like to remark on the fact that they did a very wise choice in appointing you as the special representative or a special rapporteur, and also to create this post, which I'm also glad to say that I know that Sweden was a great supporter of, and also supporter of your mandate. So I feel very proud of that, and I also hope that we will continue to support your mandate. As we heard, there are a lot of limitations to the mandate and also to the administrative around it. So I hope that, I know we have representatives here, I hope that this continues, this support continues, as it's needed for you to actually reach the results that I'm sure that you want. With a small gift, a bit Easter inspired, I just would like to say thank you very much for today. Thank you to all of you that came today.